And welcome back to the Collin Cadmus Podcast. Today, I'm joined by Justin Otley. Justin went to Radford University and then started his career as an SDR for Software AG, where he stayed for over 10 years, working his way up to Senior Director of Sales Development until landing his most recent and current position as VP of Global Sales Development at Talkdesk. Sales development is the most challenging and important aspect of any sales organization. So today's episode is going to focus specifically on what it takes to be a great SDR and to scale a world-class sales development team. After 13 years of leading sales development teams to great success, I'm excited to get his thoughts and learn his secret sauce. Before we get started, if you're watching on YouTube, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave us a comment if you have questions or feedback. If you're joining us from Spotify or Apple Podcasts, drop us a review and let us know what you think of the episode. This is much appreciated. Without further ado, let's dive in and get his thoughts. Justin, thanks for joining me, and welcome to the show.
Collin, my man, great to be here. The man with the best podcast voice there is. I'm a huge fan of your show as I initially reached out. So cool to get connected with you here.
Thank you. You're the second one to comment on my voice. And I say every time, like, I hate the sound of my voice. So I appreciate that.
Well, I'm not going to be able to match your voice today because mine sounds like shit today. I've got a sore, scratchy throat. I'm all congested thanks to my 3-year-old and my 2-year-old. But we're still here. We're going to get it done.
It's good for the immune system, at least.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, exactly.
No, but you know who has the best voice? It's Mike Rowe. Do you know Mike Rowe, the Dirty Jobs guy?
No, that's a fair point. I can't.
That's a voice. That's a voice. And he looks good too, right? Usually you have a voice like that and you're like, that's a voice for radio. Or you just got a face for radio, they say, right?
True man's man.
That guy's got the voice. Yeah. I mean, what did he do? The Ford commercials? Is that what it was?
The Ford, yeah.
Yep. And the Allstate guy, I forget his name, the black guy, his voice, all time voice, and then there's Morgan Freeman, who is the voice of God in my mind. If I imagine what God sounds like, it's Morgan Freeman. Yeah.
That's funny. They've had Morgan Freeman, I think, do some of those like Discovery, like Animal Planet stuff. Now they've got Tom Hanks doing one and he sounds great. So I'll be watching that.
Hank's voice is good too. There's a bunch of them out there. Yeah. I was actually just listening to, Adam Carolla has a podcast that just popped up on my YouTube yesterday, and he's got this guy. I don't even know who he is, but he's got like a co-pilot in there who just has this incredible voice, and he just reads lines off a script because Adam probably hates his own voice because he sounds crazy, and so it sort of balances it out. But yeah. All right. Well, look, I've got a few topics here. I'm excited to dive in with you because I came from AirCall, right? And so we were selling very similar things. Obviously, for those who don't know, Talkdesk, AirCall are cloud-based phone systems or contact centers. Talkdesk has been around longer than AirCall, has scaled bigger than AirCall. I actually was a Talkdesk user and customer before I went to AirCall. And through my whole journey of shopping phone systems as a VP of sales and getting burned and buying a bunch of junk and, my first year as a VP of sales, I want to say we went through 3 or 4 different phone systems, just constantly having problems.
Sounds about right.
Yeah. I mean, it's the name of the game, right? And so I did a very deep dive, like at the time, learning all the systems, the ins and outs, and testing all of them. And we eventually landed on Talkdesk. I did not know about AirCall at the time; they were still basically based in Europe. And so when it came time to be looking around for jobs, and I came across AirCall through an intro, I was like, wow, I really know this space. Like I know every competitor. I knew all the details of the differences. So I was real excited to get in there. I think probably a bit has changed, like SMS and a lot of things have rolled out since I have left there. But in terms of, prospecting and generating pipeline, I think we're speaking the same language. So I'll be able to relate closely to, what you guys are doing there. So I'm particularly excited to see how similar some of it is, how different it is. But before we dive into Talkdesk and SDR growth, I want to get your thoughts on a few topics here that I've been asking some people about on really the last, 10 or 15 episodes, sort of the whole second season, so to speak. And it'll lead into what we're going to talk about. So let's start with a good baseline here. And if you disagree with the statement, feel free to disagree with it. But the question is, what is broken with B2B outbound and how did we get here?
Yeah. Well, as we know, this has been like one of the most debated topics over the last, 12 to 24 months. And I think for good reason. Yeah. Because I think today the traditional outbound model, as we know it, is fundamentally flawed. Especially
so we agree on that.
Yes. I mean, mainly because, right, it was designed for a world that at least right now no longer exists. Right. So sales, we used to control all the information, and we know that information and knowledge is now being commoditized. So, back then, if a prospect, 5, 10 years ago, if a prospect wanted to learn more about a product, they had to go through us. But today, buyers have access to, AI chatbots and online reviews and peer networks and all different sources of content. And, it's kind of hard for a rep to compete with that. And so, these buyers, our prospects, they're so much further along in the journey before they ever actually engage with us. Right. So I think that's like kind of if you set the tone there. Then if you take it a step deeper, we've become obsessed and addicted and we've prioritized speed and scale and automation over the development of true long lasting skills for SDRs and for sellers and leaders, especially. So I think the skill set gap is actually growing larger each day or each month, right? So like the whole concept of mastering your craft and mastering the fundamentals of your role is becoming harder to do. And it's also, I think, becoming less important, at least from an initiative standpoint within the company. Simply because I saw this on LinkedIn the other day, and I love the way someone worded it. Can't remember who it was, but we're essentially, for SDRs and sellers, we are automating their development away.
I saw that post. I can't remember who wrote it either, but I just saw that.
Yeah, and so then it's like, okay, well, what the hell do we do? Who solves that? So let's look at our leaders. It's on us to fix that problem. But the problem is right now there is a true leadership development crisis happening too. Right. So I think leaders are
Yes.
being forced to spend more time building reports and building dashboards versus coaching and identifying bottlenecks and diagnosing issues and scaling greatness. And then when they have time to do those things, most of the times no one actually ever showed them how.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, sellers, SDRs, leaders are not actually growing and becoming better at what they do anymore, regardless of how the market is changing so rapidly, how the landscape is changing. And unfortunately, it's caught up to us.
This is such good stuff. I mean, I usually take down one note or two notes as someone's, responding, and I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Like everything you said, first of all, I agree with all of it. The info's being commoditized. They say this was back in, I want to say 2019 when I read the Gardner report that they said, and this actually was how I made my sales course. The modern outbound system had everything to do with what you said there. Buyers are getting roughly 80% of the way through the journey on their own. And that was back in 2019 before
Wow.
ChatGPT.
Wow.
So I would argue that, astute buyers are now getting farther through the journey. I know I use ChatGPT when I need something now, and it'll
Same.
tell me sort of the options, and it's been very good. Like for this
Yeah.
podcast, I would take, screenshots of our faces to make a nice little thumbnail. And the resolution is so bad because I'm using Zoom and I don't want to spend a bunch of money on junk. And I found this app through ChatGPT, and it was free, and you just like load your picture in it and it enhances it. And it's like, that's how people are shopping now.
Yeah.
And I think it's only going to become more in that direction as the age of the buyers or the generation of the buyers changes, right?
Right.
That's basically what they explained from Gardner's is at the time they said we're 5 years away from millennials replacing baby boomer buyers and Gen X buyers. And so we're sort of there now. And I think as you go into like even past millennials into Gen Z, I don't know that they're even going to want to talk to us. Like, they are literally trained from birth to use AI. My niece is talking, they talk to their Snapchat AI bot to get questions answered and stuff. So I think that's probably what we're looking at, as we go into the future.
Yeah.
And so the buyer, sorry, go ahead.
Well, yeah, I was just going to say, and then, right, like I agree with all those points. And then if you go a step deeper into the outbound motion itself, right? Like, so we talked about the automation piece. So we all know what that means. Like all the power dialers and the sales engagement platforms that first came out that were incredible. There's still a ton of value you can get out of them. But I think the problem is they masked so many different inefficiencies that were happening within our processes and our systems.
Yeah.
And now, like I said, it's caught up to us to the point where like that's no longer enough in today's environment. So like, a stat I saw the other day is it's taken on average, the average SDR, the average seller that's prospecting, it's taking 144 touches to book a single meeting. The average rep has gone from 8 quality conversations within the last like 3 to 4 years to now below 3 a day. And so, if you're having those 2 or 3, you need to make those count now more than ever. And I think the other
Yeah.
alarming one was, where we're spending our time. 30% of this was a stat Gartner dropped, I think back in November. 30% of sellers' time is spent just figuring out which accounts and prospects to target.
Yeah.
So then if you factor, where you're spending time on internal meetings, discovery calls, all the admin tasks, if you really do the math, that means then less than 30% of your, we'll just call it SDR's time is spent on pure prospecting, revenue generating activities.
Yep.
That's kind of scary.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then that's what blows my mind. And we're gonna get into this actually. We got one question before it. We'll get into the AI piece, but that's what blows my mind when people are, sort of trash talking the AI SDR and all this stuff. Because it's like, I get it, right? Like it's not capable of doing what humans can do and stuff today, but we'd be crazy to not acknowledge the inefficiency in our current sort of status quo, and doesn't work necessarily for most companies. Like it might break even. If you're in the enterprise closing some big deals, you can make it, you can make it work, but it's not a great model. It's heavily expensive. It turns over a lot of employees. And so like, we're attracting innovation, right? Like that's going to happen when you just haven't quite figured something out. So, we'll get into that in a second. But I wanted to also just comment on what you said about leadership development, because that's a big one, right? And in every role I've been in as a leader, I can tell you there's zero training. There's not a like, here's your introductory training. There's not a here's how we're going to develop you and help you get better. But what there is always, almost every time, is we're ready for the next phase VP, right? The person who can do the next stage of growth. And it's like, there's something wrong about that, right? Something wrong about bringing someone into an org and then generally exiting them because they're not ready. But then it's like, well, how much development did you provide that person? Zero? Well, whose fault is it that they're not ready? This is the status quo in B2B SaaS. This is the norm. And what I think is just absolutely nuts about it is that almost always when I look, and I would love to be proven wrong on this, and there's probably some edge cases and whatnot, but almost always when I look at a VP or a director or someone or a head of sales, CRO, whatever, who's been really successful, usually the time they were most successful was the first time that they actually did it. And so this whole concept of like, they have experience at a certain stage, I tend to see that when they go do it the second or third time, it's not to say it's bad, but it's often not the unicorn sort of thing that they went through the first time that earned them that credibility. And I tend to just think that it's because the product has so much to do with it. And so, I tend to not like this concept of just exiting sales leaders. Yeah. And I think that we need to do more developing them and preparing them. And maybe what that means is you're going to bring in someone on top of them at a certain point who has additional experience in areas they don't, and together they will grow. But too often what we see is just they're like, well, you've only grown a team to this size, so you've reached your capacity, and now we're going to cycle you out. We're going to lose all of the knowledge that you've accrued over the 2 or 3 years that you've been here. We're going to bring someone new in, and everything that you've been doing great now just like disintegrates. And then we're going to kind of make some other things great, but we just lost everything. And it seems like that cycle sort of repeats itself in SaaS a lot. Before we jump to the next question, I'm curious to get your thoughts on that. Have you seen that? I mean, that said, you spent 10 plus years at a company, which is unusually awesome. So maybe you haven't seen that as much.
Well, I've definitely still seen it, not as much with me, right? But I think it's also why people question why is the average tenure of leaders dropping so significantly. I know that's a big topic you talk about, right? Like,
I left it off this interview because you had a super long tenure, but let's get your thoughts on it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all the points you just talked about, right? Like there's that lack of development. And then I think once they get into an organization, part of what I question too is like, with their lack of a development they had when they first became a leader. And yet maybe once they got into the role, they started having success. But then for whatever reason, why they joined the next company, whether it was their choice or not, Are they trying to do the same exact things that led them to success last time, regardless of how it fits into the new industry, the new market,
Yeah.
into that company? And as part of that, because they never had the type of coaching and guidance on how to adapt that model.
Yeah.
And, is the model they're using the one that they were told to use, and they know nothing else? I was certainly guilty of that for a while in my career.
Me too.
And, right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I, started getting introduced to, that's when I started stretching myself to find some external mentors. And once I started having conversations with people like Ralph Barcy and Kevin Dorsey way back in the day, it was so eye-opening to how far behind I was and how much of a disservice I was doing to my people. And so then it was like, okay, I now need to become just as obsessed at developing myself personally as I am at working with the team and working at my job. Otherwise, we're going to continue to have that roller coaster effect where some good shit will happen, but then it's going to slow down because the market changes again, or, you know, we've got a new, a new pool of talent that's come in. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm with you. It's the same experience for me. When I went from my first head of sales training job into my first VP job, I tried to basically rubber stamp the process. 6 months into it, I learned I got to learn from scratch, like what's going to work here. And the lesson learned there was instead of coming in and thinking you know everything, instead come in and figure out who knows everything at this company and try to pick their brains, figure out everything they're doing, study everything they're doing, and then try to consolidate all those best practices into something that can scale. And yeah, I had to learn it the hard way, right? Because again, there's no one there to teach you that. And I actually think that that's part of the reason that they do cycle people in and out, is because from a founder point of view, they don't really want to have to deal with training you or developing you. And they think it would just be easier to swap someone in. Most of the time, I don't think it really is, because they're not accounting for all the downside of losing that last person and whatnot. So I do think the right way to do it is to probably just layer people, right? Maybe you start with a director and then you bring in a VP on top of them and you don't lose the director, right?
Yeah.
And they sort of are still there and you have both benefits. And then maybe eventually you go from a VP and you top them with a CRO who maybe has global experience or something of that nature. But there's edge cases to that and whatnot. But overall, yeah, I think it is something that this industry should be wildly ashamed of, is the amount of effort and money that's spent on recruiting executives, but then the fact that it's $0 spent on developing them. And then we have such a crappy average tenure.
Right. And then we look at how much we're investing into the tech stack. And it's like, how much of your tech stack? There are some tools out there that are actually designed to make your people better, but it's far and few between. And then you've got some great you've got some great trainers and leaders out there that know how to develop your people, you being one of them, right? Like, I was trying to get the budget to bring Kevin Dorsey on site for a good almost 5 years, and I finally fucking did it last year. Kevin came in on site. We flew a bunch of our leaders in globally into our, Northern Virginia office.
Yeah.
And, it's surpassed even my own expectations for how long I followed that guy. One of our SDR managers was a first-time SDR manager. He had just joined like within 30 days of Katie coming on site. Can you imagine getting that type of training within your first 30 days? And then you can imagine, he doesn't have all these preconceived notions, like what this new SDR leader, how they're building their new foundation is on Katie's BIPSI model and Wiggle, his leadership accelerator program. And it's no wonder that now, if I look at him with our other leaders, he's definitely the most process oriented, definitely on top of his system the most, definitely, has some of the best operational rigor. The way he's organized, the way he's diagnosing issues, it's fucking textbook. And that's because of the foundation he started early on.
Yeah. Yeah. So I had just as much trouble getting budgets to bring in trainers. And even though I'm a good trainer and whatnot, like, it makes a lot of sense to bring in outside help. It makes a lot of sense to get second opinions or second thoughts or whatever. And sometimes it's just to pump up the team and give them a little bit of a break from the traditional day to day. But yeah, it's too hard to do that. And the same founders that don't want to give you those budgets are the same founders that will sort of like laugh at the notion of hiring a consultant or an advisor. And I don't know where that comes from. I think it probably just comes from ignorance, right? I think a lot of founders are, and I don't say that necessarily to sound rude, but I think it's that a lot of them are doing this for the first time and
Yeah.
they raise a lot of money and they've successfully gotten to a certain point. I think there's a level of ego that naturally comes along with that. And then there's also this sort of like unbreakable bind that starts between the sort of the board of investors and the founder. And it's like they just often get to a place where they will not do anything without like consensus from the board. And I think that that's one of the most dangerous mindsets for a founder to be in, because the board, they're not operators. They're not running companies most of the time. Sometimes they've had some experience in the past or whatever. But at the end of the day, like founders need to be running their own companies. They need to be trusting their own gut. And if they can't trust their own gut, they need to trust the gut of the leaders they hired more than they trust the gut of the board. But I find that it's always the opposite. Whereas if their leader is saying something the board disagrees with, they will almost always go with the board on it. And it's like, well, you didn't hire the board to run the sales team, right? So where's that logic even coming from? Like, that doesn't really make sense. But it's at the end of the day, like, they're trying to protect their own position. They're trying to stay in the good graces of the people who give them money. And I get it. Like, that's how business works, but it's also just really bad for the rest of the people in the company, for the customers, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, agree wholeheartedly.
Exactly. Let's get your thoughts on growth at all cost. I'm curious here, kind of I guess a multi-part question, just for sort of a foundation of the question. Like, was Software AG, would you consider them a growth at all cost company? I would imagine Talkdesk was. I don't know if they're still operating in that mindset now that they're so big. Can you kind of walk me through what those experiences have been like and what your thoughts are on that growth at all cost model?
Yeah, Software AG definitely was not a growth at all cost company while I was there. They still aren't, right? So, I mean, that was a 50, 60-year-old plus company, really well established, well over $1 billion consistently, very slow, steady, reliable engine. Talkdesk, yeah,
Was it venture backed, or was it sort of built more organically over time?
definitely built more organically over time. And, while I was there, they had probably nearly 30 different acquisitions. And as they just continued to kind of build out their product landscape and the value they were bringing to the market. And then Talkdesk, right? Talkdesk's been around since 2012, definitely more of a scale up vibe. And up until right around the point that I joined here, it was definitely the growth at all cost model. And right as I joined here and there was a new wave of leadership, it's not that anymore. So I think, this growth at all costs or growth at any cost model, we know that was born in the era of like cheap capital,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Yeah.
so, I think companies and I think a lot of companies were guilty of this with how they treated SDR teams, was just throwing bodies at problems without understanding the ROI or the alignment, hiring fast, firing faster, right? And then, optimized for speed and scale over efficiency. And I think the problem is that when all that funding dried up and the interest rates started to raise, that model naturally started caving in on itself. It collapsed. And so now we're at this point where it's, VCs are looking at, it's sustainability over the unchecked growth, if you will. So,
Yeah.
and we've seen the consequences of this, right? So, we've got bloated tech stacks across the board, bloated sales teams, bloated SDR teams, unrealistic revenue targets, unrealistic pipeline expectations, and such a lack of strategic alignment across all the teams within the go-to-market motion. It was all about growth metrics to hit that next funding round. And it's not sustainable business practices. So today, obviously, we've matured into this different environment, and it's no longer about sheer volume. It's conversation I have with finance every day. It's how do we do more with less, right? Like finance, even though I think at Talkdesk, the SDR team is a bit under capacity. I want us to be at a 2-to-1, 3-to-1 ratio. We're at around like a 4.5 to 1 right now. And, finance is asking questions as we continue to refine, what we're doing on an AI standpoint, how we're becoming more efficient. Finance is asking like, hey, does that mean like will our SDR ratio change? Could we increase it? And so yeah, I think there's good and bad to that. But like, I think a lot of the folks I'm talking to within my network right now, the teams that are thriving are the ones that have already pivoted to focus more on, the efficiency, the alignment, and leveraging AI to scale smarter and not necessarily just faster, right?
I'm with you. This is all gold that you're saying. We're cut from the same cloth. And the way you described it, I don't know if you realize this, but what you described is a Ponzi scheme. And people don't like hearing that. But you explained a business model that worked while capital was cheap and being pumped into it. But the second that that capital couldn't be pumped into it anymore, the thing imploded on itself because everything was bloated valuations. That's the problem a lot of these companies are facing, especially the ones who got their valuations jacked up through the roof and did not find an exit right before that happened. They're kind of stuck now with these very expensive shares of their company. And because money is not as cheap anymore, it's like no one's really interested in buying that company, and an IPO would be very dangerous right now. I actually think, Aircall is sort of probably stuck a little bit in that situation. Talkdesk might be too. You guys are much bigger and farther along, so I think you're definitely in a better position. But yeah, it's tough. I think both of those companies probably had plans for some sort of an IPO or exit that have probably been delayed, I would imagine.
Yeah, look, yeah, I think a lot of these companies, I think it's clear that they were faking it until they could kind of make it. And when we talk about the hire fast, fire faster, like, go hire 10 people and then, you're going to fire 8 of them, while, it's kind of brutal. And even though the model works to an extent, that used to be a really simple recipe for orgs because of growth at all costs. And now, we're playing Silicon Valley's game where the underlying, math and numbers, that wasn't mattering as much. And to your point, it's like, okay, go get your next funding round, add X millions of dollars. So
that's the game, man, because when you can keep raising more money, it becomes easier. And this is, everyone should really understand this. If you want, I'm going to try to simplify all this craziness. When you can raise money at it's relatively easy. They're pumping tons of money into the economy, and that money strategically gets funneled into industries that they want to see hyper growth in, right? So there's a reason that somehow all this money is just like raining into SaaS over the last couple decades, because America wants to lead in those areas, right? So that's where the money ends up. Now, as long as that's happening, it gets to a certain point where it becomes easier to get wealthy by raising the valuation of your shares than it does to actually generate profit, right? And you can raise millions of dollars at your Series A, let's say, at a certain valuation. And then when you get to your Series B, if you can raise many millions more at a higher valuation, you can sell some of your equity. It's called selling secondary. And that's how founders get rich before their company has even generated a single dollar of profit. And for the last 10 plus years, we've lived in a world where that was the strategy. That was how you got wealthy. Hopefully there's an exit somewhere along the way. And then you're basically passing that bloated bag along to the next person, whoever acquired it or whoever bought into your next round. And they're just hoping they could bloat that bag up some more, sell their shares and get out before the thing eventually pops. Now, this worked for almost a couple decades, right? Because it didn't pop. They just kept pouring money. And then these companies would get acquired for however many billions of dollars. And it basically became the problem of whoever acquired it. They're going to either make it profitable or not, or they're going to IPO and maybe find some success. But that's where that comes from. And once you sort of cut off that spigot of money, like a Ponzi scheme, that's why I say that, because that's how a Ponzi scheme works. When people stop putting money in, everyone stops getting paid, the whole thing stops working. So that's basically what we've seen. Now, there is good stuff that comes of that. It does accelerate growth, and you do end up with a bunch of companies that are much farther along than they would have been if you told them to go slow and steady. So if you look at did this work for America? Yeah, we built a lot of great companies, a lot of great products. Did it work for the tens of thousands or millions of people that were all employed by these jobs? Well, I would argue no. We all ended up with 1 or 2 year average tenures compared to our parents who were employed for 10 to 20 years. People are getting flipped over of their jobs. People are getting screwed out of their equity. There's all sorts of problems that have become normal in our lives that were not normal 20, 50 years ago, when the world when business didn't really work that way. But anyhow, let's get your thoughts on AI, and then this is going to lead into, I want to get all your secret sauce on SDRs and coaching and leadership. But what do you think's going on with AI first? We chatted a little bit about that. Do you see the AI SDR sort of replacing the SDR altogether? Do you see it becoming a tool that they use? Are you guys using anything over at Talkdesk? Wherever you want to go with that.
Yeah, I definitely see the SDR being replaced to an extent over time. At least in 2025, the way that I view it is that AI is augmenting SDRs. So, right, I think it's no surprise that this is the biggest game changer any of us have ever seen in our industry. And most companies, at least most teams I'm talking to, are still underutilizing it, as are we. I was a little late to the game to adopt this. It was intentional because if we go back to why Outbound is broken, and we talked about like the tech stack bloat and the prioritization of speed and scale over development, I wasn't getting that jazzed about some of the AI use cases over the past year. Now, the last month has been drastically different. The amount of time I've been spending consuming knowledge and getting ahead of the curve. But part of what I kept looking at was like, okay, some of these are great and it's going to make us like more efficient in ways, but how is it actually going to make any of these people better? Like, okay, it might make this SDR more successful, which is good for the business in the short term, but is it actually going to make them better and then make them a better AE, which is much more scalable and sustainable? And so that's the way I kept viewing it. And then eventually I had a bit of a turning point where it's like, well, wait a minute, Justin, if you're going to start to buy back your SDRs and your sellers' time through leveraging AI in a smart way, doesn't that mean that now you and your leaders have more time to coach them on actually truly getting better and working on the development piece? So, I think if we look down at like the actual use cases that now excite me, none of these are going to be a surprise to you, right? But it's, I think it's automating research. It's helping SDRs to prioritize high propensity accounts, analyzing intent signals like job postings or product mentions. It's crafting different scripts and messaging and follow-ups. And then some of the exciting stuff, right, is like creating custom GBTs that can generate, hyper relevant, hyper personalized outreach by like, triangulating all the different like industry trends and pain points and competitive insights. And I think what I've gotten really excited about is that if we talk about the whole ABX motion, account-based marketing, account-based selling, this is going to be one of the biggest enablers, to help organizations become masters of ABX. It's giving you that opportunity to do that now more than ever, where it's targeting the right people within the right accounts with the right message at the right time. And then when we go back to even leadership development, if we look at like AI on the impact of sales leaders, I think the opportunities there are also endless. And I get super jazzed about that, right? Like, I think KD talked to you about this, where it's like, imagine having a call scorecard analyzer that gives your team feedback in real time, or onboarding programs that are, they simulate your prospect or your buyer's objections, and then they coach your reps through responses in real time. So all that excites me. It's a lot that we're starting to look at and implement. At the end of the day, I think the biggest caveat with AI is I think AI is only as effective as the strategy behind it. And it's funny because we've always said that about like data when implementing a new tool, right? So like, if you're using AI to send emails faster with a bit more of a personalized clip, I think you're really missing the point, and you're going to die, right? Like, I think the real power lies in using AI to enhance the human connection. And as of right now, not necessarily replacing it. Replacement can and will come eventually, but right now it's leveraging it to enhance the human connection.
I'm with you. Yeah, I think it reminds me a bit of like spreadsheets and calculators, because I try to think back to what it was like to be, an accountant or a mathematician or something when these tools were introduced, and they probably had a lot of the same reactions. They're probably like, well, our students or our employees or whatever, now they're not learning how to do math, and their mental math skills are deteriorating and all this sort of stuff. And there's a lot of truth to that, right? But it's also like, well, maybe they just don't need to be good at that anymore. Maybe that's really just not something that they need to waste their mental brain power on, because the computer can do it and they can focus on other things. And so there's some positives to that, but I do think, like, where do we end up, right? If we end up in a world where there is some sort of apocalypse or something, are we all just going to be completely like stupid if the internet turns off and we're going to have no clue how to do anything? And I noticed that with myself driving. Before Google Maps was a thing, I knew how to get all around wherever I was going, wherever I was living. Like, you just knew. But now I really don't. And I found that, like, I moved to this place like 4 years ago. And granted, I don't drive a ton, but like, even when I go out, I find myself just glancing down at the maps, and I don't know the streets the way that like I used to. And it's because I don't need to. But part of that is scary, because I do think to myself, like, if all these maps just shut down and there was an emergency, and I'm looking at like California, what's happening. I'm like, if I had to get out of here and the maps weren't working, like, I don't even really know like where to go. And that's probably not good. Right. So yeah, but I'm with you on all of that. I think there's going to be probably a lot of junk in the beginning. And that's why, there's always the people that come out and say, this is garbage, it's never going to work, all that sort of stuff. But like, I mean, if you said that about the first airplane that they built, you were wrong too. And people did say it, right? People say that about the first, usually anything that just needs to be iterated over time. So I do think that we're headed there. And yeah, it's probably a bit of a ways out before it's hyper reliable. But I do think we get to a place where, like you described, like you're on a call, and in the sales world today, like, you run over to the salesperson's desk when you hear them struggling, and you're trying to coach them and give them some tips, feed them lines and stuff. And yeah, I think, in the future, it's going to be just happening automatically on the call. Like, there's just, the coaching is just right there for them, because the computer's listening and it knows what works. And the first phase of that will probably be a sales leader has to program the AI to know what to say. But I think the future version of that is the AI literally is just listening to all your calls, and it knows what the best things to say are, and it's just literally doing it. So lots of good stuff to come with that. But it's a double-edged sword. It weakens our sharpness, so to speak. It probably deteriorates a little bit of that. But I think it gives us the time and the energy to then get sharper in other areas. And so that's what we have to be paying most attention to today. Okay, let's jump into the good stuff here. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4. I got like 4 or 5 questions here. I want to chat about SDRs and leadership.
Right on.
Let's start with, what do you think makes a great SDR, or what does a great SDR look like in 2025? If there's things that have changed drastically, or if, just design your great SDR. And maybe if there's anything that's specific to, like, this is sort of new in 2025 or something we need to look at, you can highlight that.
Yeah, one thing I've been thinking a lot about is I really want SDRs to see themselves to act and evolve as pipeline architects, as revenue accelerators, and as talent feeders. And I really want them to, right from the beginning, when they're setting expectations and going through onboarding, I think that needs to be the end goal, so that you can also be seen that way by organizations, that you are far from just meeting setters anymore. So I think in 2025, a great SDR isn't just someone who can cold call or write effective messaging or learn the art of copywriting. Those things are still very important, but they're quickly becoming baseline skills, I think. I think the SDR of the future looks a lot different, because, the role keeps shifting, and it keeps shifting to align with the changes in buyer behavior, with the changes and advancements in AI every freaking day. And now the need for much more meaningful engagements with our prospects and our buyers. So I think 2025, a great SDR is very strategic and digital savvy. They're data-driven professionals who are relentless in their pursuit of relevance and value. And the best are very adaptable, right? So they are embracing AI to become better. They're embracing AI to master their craft. They're embracing AI to streamline repetitive tasks, and allowing them to focus more on the human elements of selling, which we know is, like curiosity and empathy and problem solving. They're not afraid of change. They are embracing it, and they're thriving on it. And I think I think we'll start to see a shift where, we're going to see SDRs start to operate more as a hybrid between almost like an analyst and a marketer and a storyteller, right? So they'll be the ones that are uncovering market insights, informing strategies, bridging the gap between, like the market and the business. I think on that analyst side, that's where you get really good at extracting actionable insights from all the different data that you have to consume. And, AI is there to help you with that. It's leveraging AI intent signals or market trends to precisely target the right prospects at the right time with the right message. And it's not wasting time. It's prioritizing effectively. It's ensuring that every action has impact behind it. And then on that marketing storytelling evolvement, I think that's, crafting the relevant, personalized, value-driven messaging that is really starting to resonate deeply with your prospects. And it's, like we said in the beginning, it's not just about booking meetings anymore. It's about creating meaningful engagement and bringing trust back into the equation, which used to be a thing. So building trust early on in the buyer's journey. And I think social selling, getting really good at social selling, which is one thing we're doing great at here at Talkdesk, and content sharing, and position yourself as an SDR, as, more of a thought leader is going to start to become second nature.
I love it. A lot of that is what I preached in my course, that I see this sort of like they're becoming content creators, they're becoming mini marketers. They're also kind of becoming salespeople because they should be able to talk about the product. They should know more about the product. So I think it's not just about making them better at delivering the results we want from them, but also we have to think about what are the results that buyers want from SDRs. And it's very common that buyers will complain that they don't want to talk to an SDR. It's a waste of time. They want to get, straight to the person who knows about the product. And so I think that, advancing their skills and knowledge on the product is a big one too. Let me add a little extra question in here. How long do you think the SDR role should be, right? If someone comes into that role, I think generally speaking, most people are looking to get out of it within a year and move up. What are your thoughts there? How long do you think someone should sit in that role? And do you use that role to develop them into, an AE?
So I think part of it depends on the type of experience and expertise they're arriving with. So, like say at Talkdesk, for instance, we do have a fast track in place. If someone comes in here and they hit or overachieve their first 4 quarters, right? And if there's a couple other qualification standards that need to be met. But if they come and achieve their first 4 quarters, and if there is an opening, I'm not going to block them from interviewing for that opening, right? They now qualify to interview for that opening.
Do you only promote AEs from the SDR role, or will you hire AEs straight into that role who have AE experience?
Sorry, ask that question again.
So account executives at Talkdesk, do they only become account executives by having been an SDR at Talkdesk first?
No.
Okay, so you do.
No, but I think the good thing is that, that was one of the things Talkdesk hired me to fix was the career path was relatively broken. And I think we had this new wave of leadership that really understood the value of a talent feeding SDR organization, where if you've got the right SDR leaders and coaching and development and onboarding in place, not only is this going to be a highly more productive and effective and efficient team, but what that means for future pipeline and future revenue and future execution within the business when they become AEs, they're unmatched. So we went on this little rampage, which, is nothing compared to what companies like Rippling and Snowflake are doing. But we promoted 13 in 13 months where we hadn't promoted any in, 2 to 3 years. And now I think the other good piece is that a lot of those folks we clearly promoted the right people because they're closing their first, monster enterprise deals in the first 30, 60, 90 days. And these are some of our most successful, continuously successful AEs at Talkdesk right now. So then it created a lot of FOMO and buy-in amongst the rest of our sales leaders because they were like, well, shit, these SDRs are coming in here. They are highly coachable. They are, super hungry. They've mastered, the 5 Ps. They know who to go to for what, like people wise. They understand our process. They've mastered our persona. They know the problems that we solve for these personas, and they've started to learn how the product solve these problems. So instead of me as a leader having to coach on all that, which I don't want to do, and I have to rely on enablement for, I get to coach them on the fun shit. And that's like, the back half of the deal that they don't have as much exposure to. So we have something really, I think, exciting happening at Talkdesk. And we've seen it elsewhere through a lot of other companies. When that talent feeder is working the right way, what that actually means for the business.
I'm with you. So I've always wanted to be able to promote all of my SDRs to AE, right? I think that should be the goal, is that if you come into an SDR role, you can work your way up, right? There's an opportunity to do that. I've also found it helpful to bring in some AEs from outside, because they bring in a different level of experience and they kind of have sort of an external view. But I do find that those are actually more difficult hires to make, because the failure rate can be pretty high if you're not bringing them in to sell the right product. And so what worked really well for me at Aircall, I don't know if you guys have done this. I know you're on the sales development side, but I'll just share this tip if you guys are, need to improve your sort of success rate of outside AE hires, is we transitioned the hiring process to having a sort of a robust, what's the right word for it? Sort of a mock demo, right? And so what we would do in the hiring process, once we did our normal interviews and we sort of had a sense of like, hey, these AEs, we think they could be good at selling Aircall, but we're not entirely sure, right? Because you never are. And this is not like a secret trick, but it did work for us, and we hadn't tried it before. And once we did, we never went away from it. We would give them a little bit of training. So we'd say, hey, can you come into the office for, I don't know, 20 minutes or whatever, or maybe they would do it over Zoom. The managers would do it, and they would basically give them some high level training, and they would send them a video recording of a really good demo that we ran. And we would say, hey, we'd love to have you back next week to do a mock demo. Right. So we'll give you a little bit of training. We'll answer any questions you have. And here's a video you can watch of us doing the demo. And you can ask any questions you need while you prepare. And we'd love to see you come in and present a mock demo to us. And, I used to not be a fan of making people do things like this in a hiring process because they're not getting paid yet and all that sort of stuff. But we tested it. And above and beyond, those were the best AE hires that we made from outside, because we were very quickly able to see which ones could stand a chance and which ones just had no clue. It doesn't mean the bad ones wouldn't have figured it out, but it just means that like we gave all of them the same baseline of like, here's some info, here's how we talk about it. You give them the same instructions, and you just see the difference of quality of some of them come sounding like they have absolutely no clue what we sell, versus some of them you're like, I think they could actually maybe pitch this today to a prospect. And it was wildly eye-opening, the difference there. And we were able to bring in some really great AEs that then were able to help mentor our SDRs and train them. And some of them would bring in some outside, tips and tricks that they learned elsewhere. So I do think it's good to have a bit of a mix there. All right, this next, it helped. But again, the point I was really trying to make there was that you have to have a path for those SDRs, because if they just see that like every time an AE role opens up, you're sort of bringing in outside people, like why are they there, right?
They're going to start to leave. And then you got to find a way to stop the bleeding, right? Yeah. So we do what you talked about to an extent. I love the coaching and development piece, whether it's, 15, 20, 30 minutes ahead of time, and then seeing how they apply that. We recently changed that interview process, like literally in the last week. Oh, cool. With AEs. It's something very similar we already do on the SDR side. And I think a lot of these, I never actually answered your question directly. No, we do not only hire AEs from SDRs. We've had a lot of success there. We are still hiring a lot externally, but I think a lot of the success we've had with the SDRs to AE has forced the organization to kind of look, right, like reevaluate what our ideal AE candidate should feel like, right? What type of expertise are we looking for? It's going to change the types of questions we're asking for. And to your point, it's putting in that process of, having them kind of prove a lot of what they're saying to us, because AEs are, especially experienced AEs, they're hardwired to have these conversations and to sell us and to sell a dream and master bullshitters. So right. Yeah. We got to continue to reiterate how we're looking to evaluate them.
Yeah, I think it's a good benchmark to maybe aim for, assuming you have a decent size SDR org, maybe aim for 80% of your AEs coming from there. Better. Once in a while, like I forget the exact scenarios, but we would also be like, I would have very open conversations with my teams about like who was ready to be promoted, who wasn't. We were very open with this stuff because everyone knew what it took to succeed. And some people were like, I'm not ready. Like, I don't want to have that hanging over my head yet. And
Yeah.
I think that also comes with like people loved working at Aircall, right? So they may not love the SDR role. Not everyone's obsessed with it, but they also may be honest enough to say like, look, I'm not ready to risk the AE role because I don't want to risk losing my job entirely, right? So there's some benefits there, but the other thing is that when you promote from within, you generally end up with more affordable AEs. You're going to end up paying probably a bit more when you hire from outside. It may not always be the case, but when you're promoting someone who's never held the role before, they're going to accept generally like a relatively lower comp package than if you're bringing someone in who has 2 or 3 or 4 years experience as an AE. Because to get them to leave their last role, it needs to be more exciting financially too. So from an efficiency standpoint, and that's not ripping people off, that's paying them what they're worth. From an efficiency standpoint, if you're promoting most of your SDRs to AE, like your cost of account executives is just lower than if you're hiring everyone who has 2 to 3 years experience and they're in that sort of next tier, right? And so I would always use a tiered system. We'd have like, we wouldn't use the word junior, but there'd be like SDR, senior SDR, or like elite SDR. And then there were like ranks of AEs. And so we would always base that based on experience level. So everyone knew it wasn't like it was unfair. They're like, hey, I got promoted to AE, but you're paying this person more. It's like, no, they're in the next tier. Like they have that 2 or 3 years experience, and you can earn your way into that as well and all that sort of stuff. But that's one of the things worth pointing out to finance if you're trying to make a case for the folks who are listening, if you're trying to make a case that we want to be better at promoting people. Well, your average cost of an account executive will be lower when you perfect that process, and 80% of your AEs are homegrown, right? Rather than hiring from the outside. Okay, this next one, I saw a video of you talking about this, and I want to ask it because it's brilliant. Your issue diagnosis framework for coaching. I'm not sure if that was just a title that was put on the video or if that's what you actually call this. Do you remember what I'm talking about?
I do.
Are you cool with running through that?
Absolutely. So funny enough, this is something that I had developed, which had a totally separate name years ago. And the name is 1000% trademarked by our boy KD. So,
okay, cool.
So essentially what I used to call it, like it used to actually just be like my like SDR manager, SDR leader playbook. And it was the process I used to find bottlenecks. If an SDR was struggling, I realized that like every time an SDR was struggling with something and we sat down together in office in person and we're going through all the different possibilities of what it could be, all this lived in my head. And especially as we started to grow the team and scale the team and we hired our first manager and our next manager, I was really struggling on how to like scale that motion. And I had to basically do it all myself. And I was doing it in front of the other SDR manager because like I didn't know how to coach them to do it. So I had to start documenting it. And so it was really like my playbook bottleneck framework. And then KD, I ended up, finding as I got closer with KD, he had started creating this, well, at least he started sharing it with the world. And yeah, he calls it the issue diagnosis framework. So essentially why it's so effective is think of like any possible metric that you can look at on the SDR side of the house, whether it's open rates, reply rates, connect rates, meeting book rates, show rates, every type of conversion rate, inbound and outbound. You write all those down and then you basically create a checklist. So like, if it's like your meeting book rate or show rate, you create a checklist of like every possible scenario, every possible factor that impacts that show rate or that connect rate up or down. So then when someone comes to you, or ideally you start to get good at this, you start to see that someone's meeting book rate is starting to drop. Either below the benchmark of the team or below their own personal benchmark, before this becomes like a trend and a pattern that starts to impact the business, you can go to them and start to perform that backwards issue diagnosis framework to figure out like, okay, hey, something's off here. Before this starts to really hurt you, let's figure out what the hell is happening. What have you changed? and you go through every possible scenario because you already have it documented.
Right.
And I think the real value in with that is when, and I had learned this from KD, it's like, hey, use that exact framework to now scale greatness with your best people. So go spend majority of your time basically interviewing your best and learn why they are the best at what they do. So identify what metrics are, what metrics they're leading in that make them great. And then you have to perform that same issue diagnosis framework, but in reverse, to understand every possible process, message, movement, thought, action, execution that is leading to that. So then you can document that. You can make a process out of that and you can scale it to the rest of the team. You can coach the rest of the team on that. Forces you to, it's the best way to adapt, your playbook for the team is learning from your best people. So yeah.
I love it because when I listened to that, I was like, first of all, this is like precisely what I've done. It may be different details, but I would say maybe there might have been one thing I was lucky enough to learn in my first sales role. I mean, I learned a lot, but in the leadership capacity, they did sort of teach us this. And it was, we used spreadsheets at the time and we were managing full cycle reps. So they were doing the full thing, but it was very transactional. So there was lots of data and it was pretty sort of like black and white. It was pretty straightforward. Like how many cold calls were made, how many meetings were scheduled, how many of those meetings held, how many closed, and then like maybe how long it took to get between each of those. And so we had this very like standard funnel metrics document. And as the team got bigger and bigger, we sort of organically arrived at what you're describing, which is we would have, averages off to the right. And then you can sort of filter this thing like, okay, let's look at, the top performing reps. What conversion rate do they have from their cold calls to a meeting booked? What conversion rate do they have from meeting books to meeting held? And then win rates. And then you can sort of establish averages, right? Of like what our target is. Like for every 100 calls we make, a good rep is scheduling 10 meetings, right? And so that becomes like our benchmark, our average. And then it evolved into exactly what you described, which is that we would sort of plug in everyone's metrics. And then I can see where you're struggling, right? And so for a full cycle rep, and it's the same, it's just, it's a broader category. Like if I have full cycle reps and they're missing quota, to your point, it's like, well, where are they struggling, right? And when you can compare each sort of aspect of their funnel metrics, you can usually see like a glaring, number that's like way off from the average. And then that's basically how I would work with them to diagnose, to sort of reverse engineer where is the weakness. And then actually what it can do also is it can help you identify, or actually this is what you said too. It's funny, we're saying the same things in different words. It helps you identify their strengths. And so in tandem with what you said is like, we're going to identify the strengths and use that to create our standard process. I would also identify their strengths sometimes to show them where to double down to make up for their weakness, right? And so especially in full cycle reps, like that was a big thing for me. Big. Like I got kind of lazy on the prospecting side after having been in that role for a while, making 100 to 200 phone calls a day. But I was really good at having a high closing rate. And they started to notice my numbers. They're like, you're still the top salesperson. Why is that? And they're like, oh, wow, look at your closing rate. And they're like, why don't you keep making more calls? I'm like, come on, man. I'm like finding the better way to do this. Like,
let's figure out what the fuck that is. Why is this close rate so high? Let's get as many resources and spend as much time with Collin as possible to learn his process. We're going to document the whole damn thing.
Yeah. And that's what it was. Actually, it's funny you say that because in our process, actually, we were not allowed to do one call closes. It was a very confusing thing, but we basically had to invite people to our product. So it's a long story, but we were interviewing them to see if they were qualified for our service. And then we would call them back the next day and say, congratulations, you've been approved. And it was a very cheap $49 a month menu restaurant service, but nonetheless, I started one call closing people and they were like, you can't do that. That breaks our process. That gives away that they're not getting approved and all this stuff. But they saw how many deals I was closing and so much faster. And to your point, they finally were like, maybe we just need to change our process. Maybe we're wasting too much time. and this whole theatrics about you got approved, and maybe we don't even need to do that. And they actually stopped doing that and closing more sales and all that stuff. So,
yeah, right on.
yeah, that's it's funny. We all sort of evolved to some of these same best practices, and I think that's when you know that it's the right way to do it. Okay, I want to talk about what your outbound motion looks like at Talkdesk now today. Has it evolved a lot? I mean, what is the general outbound motion there? And then if you want to take me through, was it sort of an evolution since you came in that you've changed? But what's working over there today is the short question.
I think the biggest thing that's changed and what's working the most is the investment we've made in our frontline SDR leadership team. So our SDR leaders are really, really good. And a big part of that is
can you pause? Give me a sense of the size of the team. How many people do you have? Are there separate teams?
Yeah. So we are a global function. So we've got teams all throughout, the US and Canada and Brazil and all across EMEA. And we've got a little bit of a center of excellence developing in Sydney. And we're in that like 30 to 50 range right now.
Okay.
It's hovering right around there. And our next fiscal starts in February. So there's a lot happening over the course of the next 2 weeks with ops and leadership, determining alignments and where we need to grow, where we need to invest. But I think the thing that's had the biggest impact on our outbound motion is how good our SDR managers have really gotten.
How many of them do you have? So 30 to 50 SDRs spread out globally. How many managers?
Currently there's 5.
Okay.
So there's 5 leaders today, and yeah. So I think one of the biggest changes we made is if we look at like some year over year production metrics, like productivity, we've increased the SDR productivity by over 260% year over year. A big part of that is because like our the average amount of pipeline being driven per SDR per quarter used to be sub 400K. And now it's up to like 1.4 million. And a big reason of that is like, the products didn't change. The go-to-market didn't necessarily like change to impact that. We got much better at stop relying on, we became less inbound reliant. We became less inbound reliant within like the SMB space. And we got much better at targeting enterprise accounts.
Yeah.
And also we got better at like a bottoms up approach. So the alignment with the AEs continues to refine and get much better as far as like how we're actually working with them in a daily, weekly motion, how we're targeting these accounts together. And also one of the cool things is like as we continue to promote SDRs up into AE, those previous SDRs are, shocker, the best at working with their current SDR. And so what's happening is not only are they generating a ton of traction and a ton of pipeline, well, now we have enablement spending time with these little pods and dissecting everything we just talked about. So then, they're sharing it on all hands enablement calls to the rest of the orgs saying like, hey, AEs, other SDR motions, other SDR pods, this is what you guys need to be doing. This is exactly what's working. Here's why it's working. Here's how you implement it. So you kind of have that like self-sustaining motion, a really fun machine that's happening right there. And that's where I got to attribute the most success. If we just look like channel wise, like call, email, social, I think it varies on like the region, but like overall where we've seen the most improvement is social selling. And then right below that is our calling motion. We've instituted, a really good calling culture. There's been KD helped us with that a lot, like changing the way our scripts look, how we're onboarding these reps, where it's a lot less like virtual programs and tests and there's a lot more like deliberate practice starting to take place so that by the time day one hits where they're live on a plan, ideally they've already been hitting the phones. And we've already helped them overcome any type of phone reluctance because of all the practice we've been putting in place. We're still refining that. We're still trying to get better there, but we've seen huge improvements there.
When you came in, was it a heavy cold calling culture or did you have to bring that in?
No, yeah, we definitely had to bring that in. So
same at Air Call.
Yeah. So one thing that I started doing, this goes all the way back to like, I don't know if you ever used to follow like Steve Richard from like Exec Vision, founder
Yeah,
of
I know
Oversight.
Steve. Yeah.
Yeah, love Steve. Steve used to run these like monthly call camps, and so I started doing that at Software AG, and they were a huge success. And so then we started inviting all AEs and CS and marketing on those, and everyone was like, God, this is great. Like we're actually hearing what's happening on the front lines, but also SDRs were getting coaching not just by like their peers, but from other folks in the go to market. So we've been doing that a lot at Talkdesk too, is these monthly call camps. And even marketing recently was like, keep inviting us to this. This is helping us with our messaging. This is helping us with understanding where you guys are at, the challenges you're facing. So that's been big too.
Your phones are like riding a bike. You got to do it. You got to learn how to do it. You got to keep doing it. But yeah, I had a similar experience when I went to air call. It was maybe a little bit different in the details, but I remember my first day on the job. Now they were, Paris founded company that was moving into the US. And so they opened up a US office, hired me to run North American sales. And I came in and they had already had a team built out. So they had about 9 SDRs and a couple AEs that were being managed by the VP of marketing initially, or actually, sorry, they had a VP of sales, they let him go, and the VP of marketing was sort of overseeing it in the interim. But I remember sitting down on my first day and I'm, getting my email set up or my Slack. I'm just sort of like logging into my new laptop. And the hours of the day are sort of ticking by and I'm noticing like no one's on the phone and it's very quiet in the office. And, eventually I looked at the guy next to him, like, what time do you guys normally, start making your calls? And he's like, what do you mean? I'm like, your cold calls. And he's like, oh, well, we do mostly email. And I was like, oh, interesting. And so, I had to figure out what was going on there and dig beneath the surface. And part of it was that they were just not being trained on how to cold call. But the bigger part of it, when I got to the sort of dig beneath the surface, was that they were actually having trouble using our own product. And there was a call quality issue in the United States that I guess no one had passed that feedback along because they sort of felt awkward about it. And so it's just a great example of like, if you don't have a leader sort of owning something, you may have 9 people running around with their heads cut off because they simply don't know what to say or who to say it to. And so I had to solve that issue. I had to go to our CEO and be like, hey, we got a problem. Our salespeople don't want to use our own product because they're cold calling people and they're saying that they're basically selling a phone system. And the people are saying back to them, you have to be kidding. I can't even hear you. You're going to sell me this phone system? Like, and so we had to, they did overcome all of that. And it was like, they were just getting established with carriers in the US and all that sort of stuff that happens with new, telco systems and whatnot. But I remember that just being like, oh, fuck, that when I walked in there, like I got a lot of work to do here.
Yeah.
But we changed that culture pretty quick. We got everyone pounding away on the phones, get people comfortable with it. And all of a sudden, like you got engineers complaining it's too loud in the office. And I'm like, good, I did my job, Yeah. But yeah, so what's the plan for you guys now in 2025? Are you hiring a bunch of people? Are you implementing new processes? Are you trying to refine what you have? What's sort of the overarching, I guess, OKRs, so to speak, or, objectives for you guys this year?
Yeah. So, we're in the final couple weeks of our current fiscal year, moving into.
Oh, that's right. You're still wrapping up. Yeah.
Yeah. So we're wrapping up, but like, for instance, I've got like a 2-hour session planned with our head of RevOps on Friday, where we are just building a ton together with, quotas and alignments and finalizing territories and a lot of different motions there. I can say that, this past fiscal year, also the timing of KD coming on site was impeccable because right after
just a few weeks ago.
No, so KD came around June of this past year. So the beginning of last summer, right after he came, we went through a couple different hiring freezes as a company, which then forced us to truly, one thing KD preaches is how to become better before you're ready to grow bigger. And that was like a perfect example and a perfect time where it's like, okay, we're going to be forced to apply this training to a freaking T. And we're going to be forced to figure out, like, regardless, like, because we were promoting SDRs, promoting our best, but we weren't necessarily able to backfill, which is a tough spot to be in. The positive there is it really forced us to look at things differently and how to truly actually become more efficient within the team. How do we continue to increase pipeline? How can we, continue to, not just like say we're going to 2x pipe, but if you go down and look at other different levers you can pull, forces you to look a lot more closely at like, your connect rates and your meeting book rates and all of that, and figure out how you can incrementally make changes there. What type of systems and processes you need in place to allow you to do so. So I think we're in a really good spot right now, where we've continued to become better. We've continued to increase productivity and efficiency. And now if the business calls for it, we are very ready to continue to scale this thing. I know we have a lot of leaders and buy-in amongst AEs, and a lot of the sales leaders want more SDRs. So as a business, how do we close out these final few weeks to allow us to do so? I think that's where we're at the moment. But, even if we stay flat for the next couple of months, there's still a lot more growth and things we can continue to refine on. And the biggest area is how we are in a daily motion leveraging AI. Me and my leaders are spending a lot of time doing some external courses that we've paid for. Like Jake Dunlop's 6-week course that we found out KD did for his team. We're spending a lot of time there mastering that, because I think we owe it to our teams to not just be telling them what they need to be better at. We ourselves need to be better at these things as well. So, we are.
Is the whole team remote?
Mostly. So we've got a small on-site team in our Northern Virginia office, and we have a new headquarters in Palo Alto. So some of the hiring we'll do there, and then a majority of the hiring, there's still a lot of folks remote right now.
Did that happen during the pandemic? Was that because Talkdesk, I imagine, was not remote before that, right?
Yeah. So after the pandemic, Talkdesk offloaded most of its real estate, and then last year we got our first 2 offices in a number of years. So the Northern Virginia office is actually local to me. It's part of why we stood that up, because I can go in a couple days a week. I also really missed being in an office, so it worked out well. Because a sales floor done right is a ton of fun. So yeah, we've got a small team there. We've got some folks over in the West, but for the majority, we are remote globally, and we do have some spots we're hiring for right now, and hopefully, we're very close to promoting a number of SDRs, having another promotion wave, nice. To where then we're going to need to backfill all of them and do so really fast.
And how are you guys making that decision? I think you mentioned a little bit earlier, you're sitting down looking at numbers and figuring that out. Are you deciding to promote people based on how long they've been in their role? Are you deciding to promote them based on sort of, capacity and pipeline, and like, hey, we have too many demos on the schedule, we need another AE? What's sort of the trigger that you guys use to make that decision when you need another AE?
Well, yeah. So, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, we have those qualification standards for promotion. So there's kind of a tenure bar, there's a performance bar, and then there's like a culture/certification bar. So we define what like the minimum tenure needs to be. I just realized I never gave you like a super straight example there of like what that tenure needs to look like for an SDR. But like for us, it's a minimum of 12 months for the best person that's also aligned in the right territory at the right time. Ideally, I think an SDR should be in seat for 15 to 18 months at least. And SDRs have to get out of the motion. Like, I've got to get out of this role as quickly as possible, because I think one of the worst mistakes companies and sales leaders makes is prematurely promoting someone purely based on performance, where from like a true skill set development standpoint, they are not ready. Yeah. And then if you don't have the right program in place for new AEs, first time AEs, which most companies do not have that is a recipe for failure. And that person it could be exited relatively quickly. And that's such a shame. So I think you got to get out of that motion of get me out of this role as quickly as possible. And it's like, hey, I'm hearing, some of the most successful people, I see across the world and throughout LinkedIn. Is it a coincidence that majority of them used to be SDRs, right? And there's all these different fundamentals and techniques and skills you can learn from this role. So it's truly focus on getting the best you possibly can in this role and transitioning into, how you can apply those skills into the next role. And if performance is taking care of itself, naturally, if you're focusing on mastering the fundamentals, it's all going to progress in a much more mature and organic way.
Yeah, one of the things we found helpful, it worked really well to sort of elongate the average tenure of the SDR role, sort of keep them comfortable in the role, is in the senior sort of rank that we had, the senior SDR role. Part of what that entailed was that we're actually starting their development into AE. So you made the point there, like, what kind of program do they have in place for new AEs? We actually tried to make that part of the SDR model so that you like first you're, a regular SDR and you're 100% focused on learning how to generate pipeline, all that sort of stuff. And when you graduated past, meeting certain criteria, we would then move you into a sort of a senior SDR role. Yeah. And part of what that entailed was that they're going to spend time learning how to run demos. And we had a bit of a program so we were actually starting the training for the AE role before they were even an AE, assuming they wanted to become one, which was always the case. Yeah. Yeah. And that was pretty cool. And so we would sort of team them up with AEs that they were already setting meetings for. And basically, it was sort of a two-step thing. Like the AEs, and to your point, you mentioned this before, this was great. When you're promoting SDRs to AEs, they're great at training the SDRs, right? Because they were in that role. And so that worked really well, is because then we would pair them up with AEs, oftentimes AEs who used to be SDRs, and they'd be setting meetings for them and whatnot. And they would say, okay, like, I'm going to volunteer some time. We're going to go into, the conference room at the end of the day, a couple days a week, do some mock demos. And when the AE thought the SDR was ready to run their own demo, they would then start joining some calls together where the SDR would run the demo, but the AE would be there to sort of bail them out, close the deal, all that sort of stuff. And so by the time we were ready to promote them, they really have already done much of the AE role with someone there holding their hand. And that was really successful.
I think that's so similar to what we talked about with like get the deliberate practice of cold calling in before you're even live on a comp plan. Yeah. Right. So that like you are actually foaming at the mouth to get started and you don't have that reluctancy. Yeah. And it's the same thing. It's like start to learn that role and start to practice that role while you're in your current role. So by the time you get there, it's not going to be like analysis paralysis.
Exactly. And you know what else it does? It's not just preparing them, but it also calms them down from complaining about the promotion, because the second you throw them on a demo, they realize they have a lot to learn.
So good. That's such a
great
point.
And so there's a bit of a psychological thing that happens for them is they're all of a sudden they're like, okay, I'm going to become an AE. I can see they're developing me. But I'm not as ready as I thought. Yeah, so I'm going to stop complaining so much, right? And just focus on getting ready. But that really helps too, because then it's like, every time they ask for a promotion, it's just they sort of will stop asking once they realize they're not 100% ready. Is the shorter piece there. Awesome, man. Well, last thing I wanted to ask you is if you're hiring, if you have any roles you want to promote or announce or anything like that that's going on.
Yeah, so we are hiring in a couple different pockets right now. And as I alluded to earlier, we've got hopefully a handful of promotions on the way as we're only, a couple of weeks away from our next fiscal. So that's going to be really exciting because once we make those promotions, I need to make sure that I'm, I need to hire those backfills in less than 30 days. I can't, because, when you promote the best, backfilling the best creates, there's a big gap and it hurts, right? So like, especially if that prolongs over a certain period of time. So like urgency, there's certainly going to be some urgency on how quickly we hire someone, but like I will sit on that for months if it means getting in the truly the right person, the right fit for what we're looking for. So
do you time those backfills before the promotion takes place?
Well, ideally, we're starting to sift through our network. We're keeping that warm bench of folks we're already talking to. It's just a matter of time of when it's actually shown externally, but still being proactive, preparing for those promotions for sure.
Love it. This is all good stuff, man. Like I said, I think we're cut from the same cloth. We've lived a lot of the same experiences. Where can people follow you? Obviously, you are on LinkedIn. If people want to check out Talkdesk, go to talkdesk.com. I imagine you'll have jobs and opportunities and everything is probably on there. I tried to find you on X. Are you on there?
I'm not. Okay. So I'm on LinkedIn and I'm not super active there. It's funny, when I'm most active on LinkedIn is when we're making the most promotions, because that's generally the most of what I'm talking about. it's a mix between helping build that person's brand that got promoted, but also creating that talent funnel. Sorry for the noise. My cat just knocked over a gate. It's creating that excitement of talent coming inbound as well. But yeah, hit me up on LinkedIn. I tried to sift through the real requests versus the sales requests.
Yeah.
I'm not great at it. I'm not one of those guys that says like, I'll get back to every message. I don't know how those people do that.
I don't, for sure.
I'm trying to figure out how to be better at it. I missed some really important ones there. So hit me up there. Hit me up on, if you can find my email, which hopefully you can. And yeah.
Yeah, let them find it, right? If they can't figure it out, they're probably not qualified anyway. Good stuff. Well, Justin, hey, thanks so much for joining me. This was a good chat, and I'll be curious to catch up a little later in the year and see how things are going.
Right on, Collin. Thanks so much for having me, dude.
Likewise. Thank you.